President, thank you. Thank you for your remarks on the floor earlier this afternoon. I rise to have the Senate have a conversation about S-140, a package of 3 bills that will have positive benefits on Indian country. 2 bills in the package. The senator from Arizona was visiting about one of them. 2 bills in this package of S-140, the White Mountain Apache Water Rights Quantification Act, sponsored by Senators Flake and McCain, and Senate Bill 249, a bill to provide the Pueblo of Santa Clara may lease for 99 years certain unrestricted land, sponsored by Senator Udall and Senator Heinrich, senators from New Mexico. They've already received unanimous consent in the Senate. The 3rd bill in the package, the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act, was attached as a message from the House to Senate Bill 140 by the House in January. I'm a sponsor of this legislation in the Senate, which should be non-controversial in a chamber where members of the Senate profess to be supportive of tribal sovereignty. Mr. President, this bill, this concept has been around since 2005, and I became interested in this topic and introduced legislation in 2013, now 5 years ago. I've made it a point, I suppose all of us from time to time may introduce legislation that's a messaging point or a talking point. In this and most every other case, when I introduce legislation, I work hard to see that it becomes law. And I work in a bipartisan way to bring Republicans and Democrats together, rural and urban members of the United States Senate to work together, and this is an example of that. There is nothing about this legislation that is a messaging to tribes or to others. It's not introduction of a piece of legislation that's designed to make a point. It's a piece of legislation designed to become law. And this bill has passed the House and now is pending here in the Senate today. I hope to use this opportunity to convey to my colleagues that this legislation is not a radical proposition, but rather a restoration of the sovereign status of tribal governments. Indeed, by moving forward with this legislation, we can enshrine the status quo that existed for 70 years after the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, until the National Labor Relations Board stripped tribes of their governmental status under the NLRA. By making explicit that tribal governments are distinct and sovereign and capable of making their own decisions, we will correct a decade-old error made by the NRLB. Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act is simple and narrow. It amends the NLRA to exempt tribally owned entities operated on tribally owned lands. No more, no less. It exempts tribally owned entities operated on tribally owned lands. Businesses owned by individual tribal members or operations off tribal lands still remain subject to the scrutiny of the NLRB. Many of those who have expressed opposition to this bill will say, I support tribal sovereignty, but if you have to qualify your support for tribal sovereignty in order to protect your own interests instead of the tribes, then no, you really don't support tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is something we believe in which tribes of Native Americans, those who inhabited this country before our ancestors arrived, they were granted the sovereignty over their own business decades, generations ago. It's been voiced on the Senate floor that this is not about sovereignty, but about an attack on labor. It's simply not true. One accusation is that this bill is truly an attack on labor because it doesn't provide exemptions from other federal legislation. If my colleagues who are objecting in this way to this bill because of its narrow scope, if they're saying that, would they support making it broader? I think the answer to that is clearly no. If they're serious about that, let's have a conversation. I'm not new to tribal issues. My beginning in this topic began when I was elected to the Kansas State Senate, now a long time ago. I was a freshman member, happened to have a law degree, and was assigned by the leadership of the state Senate to conduct negotiations and to chair a committee on Indian gaming in Kansas. And I spent the next 2 years in front of a federal district judge negotiating an agreement under IGRA for Indian gaming in Kansas. Other examples of our efforts include the passage with Senator Heitkamp of North Dakota, general welfare exclusion legislation that passed this Senate and became law now several years ago. Again, trying to make clear that tribal decisions made on behalf of tribal members are much better decisions than those made by Congress, but especially by those made by agencies and bureaucracies, in that case, the IRS, today, the National Labor Relations Board. We've also worked on other issues related to tribal interests, including a carcieri fix and the ability to bring land into trust, issues that are important to tribes across the country. My point is, this is one of another pieces of legislation in a series that the Senate has pursued in which we are doing right by those who preceded us as our ancestors settled America. I don't think that the critics of this bill want tribal governments exempt from other statutes either. No, the objection isn't about the sovereignty granted by this legislation. It's not that it doesn't go far enough. It's what it does grant sovereignty for. I'd ask my colleagues, if the Senate denies tribal sovereignty in this instance, what tribal rights are not to be targeted next? Again, the point being that if you're for sovereignty in all circumstances, and you don't have the ability to choose. It's based upon a legal and moral obligation that we have to tribes here in the United States. Others have criticized this legislation. They've voiced that non-tribal members cannot vote for tribal governments, and therefore this is different from states. Again, this legislation makes tribes in the same position under NLRB as states and local units of government. But that's not true either. A person living in the District of Columbia who works in Virginia is subject to Virginia labor laws without having a say in forming those laws. In 2013, there was an issue of tribal sovereignty on the United States Senate floor. It was broader than that. It was VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and I supported its reauthorization, which included new authorities for tribal governments to protect Native American women when they're harmed by non-Indians. With VAWA's passage, Congress placed our trust in tribes to exact justice in the circumstance of domestic violence and violence against women. The point here is that we rightly determined that tribes should have the ability to punish Indian and non-Indian violent offenders. But today it's being argued we can't trust them to treat Indians and non-Indian employees justly. I remember the allegations against my colleagues who voted against VAWA that they were not supportive of tribal sovereignty. Those who will oppose this bill today are subject to exactly the same criticism. There's also an assumption that's being made that employees of tribally owned entities are being treated poorly or will be treated poorly if this legislation passes. The majority of tribes are located in rural areas where the labor pool is often inadequate. It is to the tribe's advantage to treat their employees fairly in order to retain them. As a matter of fact, many tribes have the highest wages and provide the best benefits in their region. Tribal jobs are coveted because prospective employees know what they stand to gain by their employment. The idea that tribal governmental enterprises workers should be treated as commercial rather than governmental workers doesn't hold up. A tribal casino worker is no less of a government employee than an employee of a state-owned and operated enterprise, and that can include liquor stores and ski resorts and, yes, casinos. In 2015, the Senate Indian Affairs Committee held legislative hearings on the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act, the legislation we're considering today, and testifying before the committee was Robert Welch, chairman of the Viejas Band of Kumeyaay Indians in California. Despite being a unionized tribe, the employees on the tribally owned facilities are union members. Chairman Welch testified in support of this bill, Many tribes welcome labor unions. That's fine. The point is, it's their decision. The tribal decision is where this issue rests. The point of this legislation, it is up to the tribes to decide, not the NLRB. More than 160 tribes and tribal organizations support this legislation and have worked hard to see for its passage. They support it because of the principle of tribal sovereignty is critical to their well-being. The vote I seek today is not a partisan ploy. I've worked to pass this legislation without a recorded vote. I've taken to the floor to do so for a live UC request on a number of occasions, but have met objections. I worked to get this legislation included in the appropriation bills, but it was always forced out at the last minute. In the recent bipartisan legislation, Republican leadership and Chairman Hoeven and I were open to attaching NAHASDA, TSLA, with TSLA, but TSLA inclusion was deemed unacceptable. This is not about making anybody cast a difficult vote. We've tried to do this in a way that eliminates that option, that necessity. We have two victories lined up for Indian country, NAHASDA and TSLA, and we got nowhere because of the opposition to tribal sovereignty. That brings us to where we are today on the Senate floor. It requires a Senate vote that will take place in a little more than a half hour. It's important to note that tribal sovereignty enjoys bipartisan support. Nearly 24 Democrats, including members of the House Democratic leadership, supported this legislation in January when it passed the House, and we have a strong bipartisan backing in the Senate as well. The Senate Committee on Indian Affairs reported this out by voice vote last summer. Democrat colleagues of mine have spoken in favor of it. The late Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii wrote in 2009, and I quote him, "Congress should affirm the original construction of NLRA by expressly including Indian tribes in the definition of employer." Daniel Inouye, Senator Inouye, has held high regard, continues to be held in high regard in the United States Senate for his work in the United States Senate and for his service to his nation, but for his firm commitment to tribes and to Native Hawaiians. Again, Senator Inouye, no longer with us, says Congress should affirm the original construction of NLRA by expressly including Indian tribes in the definition of employer. What this bipartisan consensus demonstrates is that this is not about labor. This is about the ability of tribal governments to be treated equally as other levels of government and to provide vital services to their people without fear of work stoppages. Jefferson Keel is the president of the National Congress of American Indians, and he wrote in February, and I quote him, "Tribes make an array of public services available to their tribal citizens and other local residents. Law enforcement, fire, EMS, schools and hospitals, natural resource management. These are things that tribes do on an ongoing daily basis for tribal members and for residents. All tribal governments play a critical role in ensuring the safety and health and the stability of tribal and surrounding communities." He goes on to write that Congress in 1935 did not want the kind of labor strife and work stoppages that could paralyze federal, state, and local governments, jeopardizing public health and safety in the process. 80 years later, why it is that every other form of government in this country is treated one way and tribes another. That, my colleagues, is not right. Why do tribes have to accept others determining their workplace rules, but not their counterparts? Why is it the well-being of Native Americans on reservations who rely on these services might be placed at risk? But most importantly, why would we deny sovereignty when tribes are entitled to it? Senator Udall, my friend and colleague from New Mexico, who serves as our committee's vice chair, the ranking member, understands the importance of self-governance. He recently said, and I quote Senator Udall, "Decisions made by tribes for tribes produce the best outcome for their unique communities. Is there a United States senator who doesn't believe that decisions made at home are better because we're all unique? We have unique circumstances in every state across the country and every community. Local folks can make better decisions about what makes sense in their local community. We know that for our constituents. We should know that for tribal members. Again, Senator Udall, decisions made by tribes for tribes produce the best outcome for their unique circumstances. What we will be voting on shortly is really a question of whether the members of this chamber, United States senators sworn to uphold the Constitution and to fulfill their responsibilities, whether United States senators believe that tribal governments elected by their members possess the right to make informed decisions on behalf of those they represent. I say they do, and I hope that most of my colleagues, in fact, I hope all my colleagues agree with that sentiment. Mr. President, we've been working at this legislation now for 5 years. Decisions will be made in 30 minutes from now that will have a huge consequence, perhaps not on me, perhaps not on many of my constituents, but upon tribal leaders and the individual tribal members who elected them to make decisions on their behalf. We would be offended when people intrude upon our ability to make decisions upon our constituents, and tribal leaders are no different. This is important legislation. It's not political. It's about making the right decision for the right reason so that good outcomes can benefit all Americans, all who live here in the United States. And I ask my colleagues to seriously consider and ultimately vote for this bill, S-140, that includes the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor.